In this video, we will add a control bone that we can use to open and close both the claw fingers at the same time. In order to do this, we will introduce two new constraints. The first constraint will give invisible boundaries to the control in order to limit how far we can move it. The second constraint will map the movement of the control bone to the rotation of the claw bones. As always, we will work with care and precision to make sure the control and claw bones remain in the proper hierarchy structure of the rig so nothing breaks or gets out of place. So congratulations, this will be the last piece of the rig to add to the robot arm. At the end of the video, we will have a completely rigged, animation-ready robot arm that we can move, extend, rotate, and open and close, all with only 3 easy-to-use controls. So now we have our wrist that rotates everything, and then our bones that will open and close. But we don't want to open and close the claws individually because that takes too much time. We want one control that we can just slide up and down that will open these both at the same time. So let's go into edit mode and then make sure that this piece, this tail here, this joint where everything comes together, is the only one that's selected. And you know what? You can still see the outline around our geometry. Let's quick go back into object mode and just make sure that the armature is the only thing that's selected. And then we can go back into pose mode and then tab into edit mode. Okay, so now it's easier to see the things that are selected. So I'm going to go into side mode and then make another bone that's going to act as our control. So E to extrude and pull that out. And this next step is really important. If we move any of these bones right now, they are all connected to each other. So you can see, no matter what I move, they all are connected at this joint. So another thing that we need to make sure is that everything is in the proper hierarchy. So let's go into side mode. We want to select this one, press Alt-P and choose Disconnect Bone. We don't want to clear the parent because we want it still to be parented within the hierarchy, but we want to be able to move this by itself without everything else moving, as you can see here. So if I move this now, you can see it's not moving the rest of the bones, but we do still have this relationship line, meaning it's still parented to the wrist bone in the proper place in this hierarchy, which is what we want. So Control Z to undo that, just make sure that's still parented, yep, and right click to cancel that action. And if I move the other bones, you can see they're still connected. So this is the proper setup. Again, this is really, really important. These 3 are connected, but this one is not, okay? Okay, let's go into pose mode and go back into tweak mode. And now we're going to change the shape. Come to our bone properties, scroll down to our custom object, and we're going to choose the empty circle we made last time. Okay, but this isn't the proper rotation, so let's rotate it. It looks like that's going to be on the X. If it's not on the X, just make sure you know which one that you need to rotate it on. Click in here, type 90, enter, and let's just make sure that's squared away. So I'm going to grab this and move and just make sure that's kind of flat on these here. Let's just zoom in here. And yeah. That's flat enough. I mean, you can mess with the rotation of these other ones here like this if you want. This is something you actually don't need to be too picky about. This is just for more visual representation here, but this is good. So let's scroll up here to our actual location, and we want our location on the X, Y, and Z to be 0. So let's start there. We want our rotation mode to be X, Y, Z Euler. And we don't want to be able to rotate it or scale it, so let's just lock all of those. We also don't want it to move on the, let's see, don't want it to move on the x-axis. Let's see what that's doing here. See, we do that. See, that's that way, that's this way. We don't want to move it on those because we want to be able to just move it up and down to be able to control the claw bones. And now with everything else locked and the Z is the only available axis to move this on, all I have to do is click and drag, and then it doesn't matter where I move my mouse, it's always going to move just up and down. Great. So I also noticed that we have not changed the names of these bones since we've created them. So let's go ahead and do that. So this one will be the claw-L for left, and then the other one will be claw-R for right. And this one is going to be our claw control. Claw control, that's funny. Sounds like a children's show. Okay, but we're going to say claw-C for claw control. Okay, so like I said, we want to be able to drag and move this, but we don't want to be able to drag it all the way up here or push it all the way down here. We need to put some invisible boundaries here so that it doesn't go past certain points. So to do that, let's go to our bone constraint properties, and we're going to add in a limit location. And then we're going to enable the minimum for the Z and the maximum for the Z. You can see it disappeared. Well, not really. If we scroll out, it just went down here because now it's at a minimum and maximum of 0 in our world space. So it's all the way down on the floor. So we want to make sure this is local space, local to the object. So it pops right back up here. And now if I click and drag, it doesn't go anywhere. And that's just because we've limited it to 0 minimum and maximum. So we need to change that. So I'm going to disable maximum here for just a moment and go back into our bone properties. And we want to find out where along the Z we want it to stop. So let's just go into side mode and see where we want that to stop. I'm just going to drag that, and I think maybe right about, oh, let's do right about here. Now, we're going inside of our wrist control here, so let's select a wrist control. Scroll down to our viewport display, and we're going to change the scale to 0.6. That way it fits a little bit neater over this joint here, and it gives us a little bit more room. So back in side mode, we just have a little bit of a gap, and this is just going to help us to be able to select both of these later, so they're not too close to each other. Okay, so let's select this one again, go scroll back up, and we can see this is roughly 0.21. So I'm going to type in 0.21 here, enter, and that's a little bit too low, so I'm going to try 0.22. There. So I like this position. This is going to be up to you, and the numbers might be different for your situation. So just test things out and see what looks good for yours. So now we can hover the mouse over this value, press Ctrl-C to copy that, and then come back to our bone constraint, enable Z maximum, and then Ctrl-V to paste that 0.22. And now you can see, if I click and drag, it doesn't go past 0.22. So it's 0 as a minimum and 0.22 as a maximum. But let's just say it's at 0 and I click and I drag up, and then it stops here. But if I keep my mouse button down and I keep clicking and dragging all the way up here like this, let's say that's where I stop and I let go of my mouse button. And now if I want to bring it back down, I click and I drag and nothing is happening, nothing is happening, nothing is happening. Well, why isn't this moving? What's going on here? And let's try that again. So scroll out, let's say click and drag, nothing happening, nothing happening, nothing happening. Oh, not until I get way down here. That's when this starts to move. Now, if you don't know what is happening here, this is going to drive you crazy because you're going to be moving stuff and then you're going to say, oh, well, what's going on? How come I can't, it's stuck. How come it's not moving either way? So I'm going to show you what's happening. Let's go back into our bone properties, and you can see the location of the Z is 1.1, which I thought was impossible because we actually set this here in our constraint to stop at 0.22. But it's way past 0.22. So that means if I click and I drag, you can see that nothing happens in the viewport. But if I click and I drag down, you can see that value over here is changing. So click and drag down, and the numbers will keep going down until it reaches 0.22. And once it reaches 0.22, that's when you're going to see it in the viewport start to move, as you can see, just like that. And it's the opposite way here. So this is going to be, if I click and I drag past 0, you can see this is going way past 0. So if I now change my mind and I want to go the opposite way, click and drag, it's not going to move until it hits that 0 in the transform value, and then it will start to go. So this is really, really not helpful, but thankfully there is a very easy solution. So if we come back over to our constraint, all we have to do is click Effect Transform, and that means if I come back over here, the transform here will always match the preview if I pull this up and it stops in the preview, you can see no matter how far I pull my mouse past now, it stays at 0.22 as the maximum. And then if I click and I drag down, it will stay at 0 at the maximum. So we can only go up to 0.22 and down to 0. Perfect. Now that we've got that, I don't want the minimum to be 0 because this is going to be our resting pose. So we want to go a little bit further than that. And so what I've decided is if we come to our bone constraint again, I'm just going to click in here and type minus 0.22. There we go. So that's even. So we've got 0, and then we go all the way up to 0.22, and then we can come down to negative 0.22. You can see there. Great. So now we have our control. We've got the limitations, but what I want is to make sure it is in the hierarchy and it's not messing anything up when we move everything else, which we should have done before, but I think we'll be okay. So if I click and drag this, you can see it moves just fine with our rotation, and we can still click and drag this as we would expect. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to test it with one more thing. We're going to test it with the bone move control. So let's open up our armature here and find the bone move. And I'm going to right click on that and unhide. Now, depending on your version of Blender, it could be a little glitchy. We unhid this bone move, but we don't see it. All you have to do is click around the area it should be, and then it pops into place. So I'm going to click that one, and we're going to click and drag and move this, and just make sure even though it's floating in the air right now, it's still connected to everything else. We just can't see it. But we just want to make sure that this control is acting as it should, and it's staying in the proper place no matter where we move this, because this is a good place for us to make sure everything is still working properly. Okay, looks like it is. So let's select everything, go back into our resting pose. And then I'm just going to click this one and H to hide that again. All right, we're almost there. We have one hurdle to cross, and that is connecting these two bones to this one. So here's what we want to do. We want to connect the location of this, whether it's up or down, to the rotation of these bones. So we're going to map the location to the rotation. But first, let's restrict some of the bones movements. Remember, we just want this on rotating on the Z-axis. So let's come over to our bone mode, change that to XYZ Euler, and then we're going to lock the X and the Y because we only want to rotate it on that Z-axis. So let's do that for this one as well. Lock, and rotate. And I'm just going to bring this in. We're going to just double check to make sure these are lining up perfectly right now in front mode so that we can avoid problems in the future. Okay. Yes. So they're still lining up. That's great. So let's zero those out again. All right. So we can connect the rotation of this to the location of this with another bone constraint. So select this bone, go into our bone constraints. We're going to add in a transformation. Now the transformation constraint is a wild beast. And if you don't understand how it works, it can get really confusing really quickly. But thankfully, everything that we've done up till now, all of the precision and care we took to make sure everything was set up properly, has set us up for success when using this transformation. So it should be pretty straightforward and pretty easy to set up. So let's select our target, which is going to be our armature and the bone claw control, claw-C that we have. And we want to make sure we are in local space for both of these, like all of our other constraints. And so we have two drop downs here, a map from and a map to. Before I open them, the map from is going to be from our target. So we're going to take the information from our target, which is going to be the location, and we're going to map it from there, and we're going to map it to here, this bone, the one that the constraint is on. We're going to map it to the rotation of this bone. So we're going to map from location to rotation. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up map from first. So we already know we want the location, so make sure that's selected. And we already know which axis it's going to be on the Z-axis, and we already have our minimum and maximum values. So if we select our control, here are the minimum and maximum values we already have set. So it's negative 0.22 and 0.22. So let's go ahead and select this bone, and we're just going to type that in here. Negative 0.22 for the minimum and 0.22 for the maximum. That should be pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and close this one and go to our map 2. Now we're mapping to the rotation of this bone. So let's select rotation. And if I scroll down, you can see we have this order as default, and way at the bottom we have this mix as add. We do not have to change either of those, so keep those the same. The next part is going to be a little bit confusing because of the way Blender words things. So we have the Z source axis, and then we have a drop down, and we can choose either X, Y, or Z. Now in this instance, we're using the Z axis for both of them. So this is going to be the Z axis on the location, and this is going to be the Z axis on the rotation. So this is actually really easy, but it's not always that straightforward. So the XYZ here that is not in the drop down, this is going to be for your bone that you have selected. And the ones in the drop down are going to be from the target location, the map from. An easy way to remember that is whatever you choose in your target, you can see it says from. So it says map to Z from, and we want to take it from the Z. So we're using Z here, we want to take it from here. So the Z axis here has a source axis of Z from the source object. And we're going to start with the maximum. So let's just bring this all the way up to the maximum and then select our bone again and scroll down. So at a maximum of 0.22 for our map from, we want to map to a maximum of however many degrees. So if I click and drag in here, we want to see where the maximum this should be open. Now let's get a better angle here because we want to make sure that the pieces are not colliding with each other. So obviously in the real world, pieces don't go through each other. They would stop maybe right about here, which is about 28. So I'm just going to click in here and type 28. Enter. Perfect. So let's see what we have. If we click and drag this, oh, look at that. So now we can see the location is mapping to the rotation, of the claw. But this is just our maximum location. We need to actually define our minimum rotation based on the minimum location. Right now, if I go all the way down to the minimum location, then you can see it's at a 0 rotation. But we want this to be fully closed when our control object is at the minimum location. So let's go into front mode and let's adjust the minimum rotation, and we're going to go into the negatives here. So when the minimum of our control is negative 0.22, we want this to be a minimum of around, it looks like 13. So I'm just going to type in minus 13 here. And now this is fully closed and this is fully open. Awesome. And don't forget to save, by the way. If you Control S will save, and then you can see saved, and then you can see what we have here. This is going to be the name of your blend file. If you haven't saved the blend file yet, it'll ask you to name it and put it in a directory. Just go ahead and do that. I'm sure you've already been doing that up until now, but just a good reminder, you want to save often, especially when we're working with such precision on these rigs to make sure that they don't break. Okay, so we are almost done. We don't actually have to redo all of the work for this one, thankfully, because we can just select this bone, shift select this one, come over to our transformation drop down and choose copy to selected. And now you can see it's affecting both of them at the same time, but of course they're using the same exact values. So we need this bone to use the opposite values, so we need to invert this. So this should be positive 13 and this should be negative 28 for that bone. And now we have a control that opens and closes both of these claw fingers at the same time. Really easy, just click and drag that. Now let's just again make sure these are lined up. Yep, they are lined up like we expected. So again, if there's something wrong with that bone roll, let's just go in to edit mode here. And if we change this, okay, copy, and if we change that at all, you can see this is what I mean. So if you have something that looks like this, then what you're going to want to do is come in and change your bone roll to something a little bit better. and you can kind of go back and forth to see what it should be. It's a little bit tedious, but we already knew it was 85. If I Control V to paste that in there, it's exactly why I copied it. So come back out here. There we go. Awesome. I think that means we are done rigging our robot arm. So let's see our final results. Let's / out of local view. We want to hide these two bones because we don't need to select them at all. We can just use this control to open and close those. And let's come back over here to our bone move, right click, unhide, and then click in here to make sure that we can see it. And this is all we need. We only have 3 controls that are very easy to select, very easy to move, and it moves our robot arm in exactly all of the ways that we want it to move. Now I do notice one thing, we did change the scale of this to be a little bit smaller, so let's select this one. I'm going to change the scale of this one to be a little bit smaller, so we'll do 0.5 instead of 0.6. That way we can select each of these easier, and that's why you don't want to make each of these controls too close to each other. But we've got a good setup here now, so we can do this, something like this. And if we bring this out, we can extend it out with our little extender piston here. And that still is working very well with this. So we rotate it, and let's say it wants to pick up something on a shelf up here or something. And then we can open it here. And actually, ideally, we would have it open right here. So be it, and then as this is pulling up, and then once it gets up here, close, and then we'll pull this back, and then maybe we'll come over here and we'll put it down here on the floor, or that's not really on the floor right now. There we go. Something like that. And these controls are so easy that we can select them at distances if we need to move them and adjust them from a distance. And the robot arm moves exactly how we would expect a robot arm to move in the real world. And you know what that means. It means it is animation time. We are ready to start animating this. Let's go into our resting pose here and our side view and make sure we save it. And in the next video, what we're going to do is clean up some of this stuff. We're going to clean up some of the outliner here so that we can select stuff a little bit easier. And we still have rogue pieces down here, such as this one in here, that we need to parent properly. So we're just going to do a little bit of cleanup in the next video, and then after that, we will finally perform our animation where we can do a similar thing that we did in part 1, where we pick up a can of beans, but this time we can make it reach up on a shelf using our new extender piston. So I'm super excited to get started with that. When you're ready, head on over to the next video.